Hi guys, before we get into part 2 of our Anne Boleyn rankings, I need to bring up a few things that are going to come up in this list, because there are going to be things that are brought up not in too much detail, but things that might be uncomfortable to some audiences, so viewer discretion is advised. I'm going to be addressing assault, and sexual assault at that, as well as the extreme appropriation of culture via blackface. I can't not bring it up. I would feel as if I'm just trying to walk on eggshells if I ignored it. But I hope you really enjoy the video, and please like, comment and subscribe, and help me get up to 1,000 subscribers so I can start writing community tabs on my channel. And I would really like to hear what you have to say, and let's get into the video. As Henry VIII's most popular wife out of the 6, Anne Boleyn has the most on-screen iterations, with varying degrees of interpretation, and I'm sad to say I have a beef with a lot of them. I've tried to gather as many as I can, but there are a few you won't see on this list. Two notables being Young Bess and the Spanish Princess. The first because the copies are really expensive and hard to find, and she's barely on screen for more than a few minutes, so it barely counts as a cameo. And the second is because I rage quit after that Flodden episode, but from what I've heard it's not worthy of my time. If it's bad enough for Philippa Gregory to veto stars from any further adaptations of her work, I don't care to imagine how awful it can get. And the same rules still stand as with Catherine of Aragon. No documentary enactments, no parodies, and remember, this is a subjective list. So if you do like some performances more than others, that's completely fine. Please tell me the Pit of Bad Tudor movies doesn't go any deeper than this. There's so much wrong with this film, I can't cover it all. I might have to revisit it someday. Yes, I know this is an independent production and you can only do so much with a small budget. But keep in mind, I've spent 3 years working in a theatre that's meant to house community productions. And I've seen so much better than this half-hearted docudrama. This film is meant to explore what turned Mary Tudor the Younger from the beloved daughter of Henry VIII into everyone's favourite hangover cure. Of course, Anne Boleyn is going to make an appearance. To borrow a phrase from Lindsay Ellis, thanks, I hate it. Do you know what Anne's first awful act of the movie is? She doesn't let Henry cop a feel. That bitch. Odd that they don't mention Mary being made to serve Elizabeth, or the threat of earboxing she received from claiming to still be legitimate. You know, things to actually justify Mary's contempt. She just hates Anne because she replaced her mother. The movie isn't long, so Anne is killed off in about 20 minutes. For some reason she cuts her hair before the execution, even though she still wears it in a coif, so there was really no point of that. As for the execution, I'm going to save each interpretation of said execution until part 3, but I need to mention it here too because it does justify its place on the list. At first I thought this was some sort of documentary or docudrama, which would obviously disqualify it from being on the list. But then when she's on the scaffold and the swordsman's about to swing, there's a weird scene where the blindfold falls off and she just starts cackling for literally no reason. What was up with that? I'm just glad to get this one out of the way. We'll never speak of it again unless I want to look into Mary the First screen iterations, or I want to just tear it apart for fun.
My name is Anne Boleyn, and I am not yet married, nor even betrothed.
You know, if I hadn't seen The Witcher, I would never have known that Jodie May can act. This film is only 1 point above Bloody Mary because the film is somewhat better lit than the other. In a movie that takes reasonably good actors and puts them in the Tudor equivalent of The Room, Jodie's is the worst performance of the movie. There's an odd feature to the movie, where every few minutes, Mary and Anne sit right in front of the camera, breaking the fourth wall, like they're in Hampton Court's diary room on Ye Olde Big Brother. Is that an outdated reference? I don't care. These weird segments offer absolutely nothing to the narrative. I'm sure they were added to look something like a found footage movie. It certainly doesn't give Anne a good first impression when literally her first scene after the credits has her giggling like an idiot. Was Jodie drunk during this? I don't know who she thought she was playing, but she certainly wasn't Anne Boleyn. Seeing her try to talk to Henry like she's bloody Fluttershy clearly shows no one did their research. She grew up influenced by powerful people and gained plenty of experience on how to play the game. She wouldn't dither like this. And when Jodie's Anne becomes queen, she exchanges her deranged smirking for constant yelling. Let's go through a list of all the stupid things this incarnation does, shall we? Number 1. Openly flirting and snogging Henry Percy in public. Somehow it took Mary catching them banging in a closet to be caught and had their union broken up. Number 2. Accusing Henry of cheating in front of the court. I said this was a dumb idea for Catherine of Aragon to do, but it's even dumber for Anne, who doesn't have foreign support. It's not just a dumb decision to have for dramatic purposes, it's also a stupid thing to do for narrative purposes, because all it does is reveal disharmony between the couple and give the other factions incentive to press their advantage. And number 3. Sleeping with her brother. Not only does no one find out about it, so it's pointless, but doing this is some effed up way of trying to frame Anne as actually deserving to get her head cut off. And number 4, she finds out that Henry and Cromwell are plotting to kill her at least a few days before getting arrested by conquistadors. Seriously, look at the helmets. And she does bugger all to prevent it and simply gives up, unlike Anne, who protested her innocence to the very end. It was as if she wanted to get beheaded, or I don't know, this bloody movie. It's not so bad it's good, it's so bad it's boring. And I am not done with it. I am going to come back and I'm probably going to do some sort of CinemaSins parody pointing out everything that's wrong with this movie, and it's going to take a while. There'll be like a sin for every bloody frame of film. If you're interested in seeing it, just watch The Witcher instead and enjoy a Jodie May performance that is actually good.
Fail to give the king his annulment. Well, only someone very close to him might be able to dissuade him from, well, acting on impulse.
Do you know how much it hurts to see an actress you grew up admiring so much be put in something so bad? The same person who wrote this travesty also wrote The Crown, and I absolutely refuse to watch it because of how Anne Boleyn was treated in this. If Six the Musical was about who was portrayed the worst in this miniseries, Anne would win the competition, no question. I still haven't forgiven my Year 12 history teacher for thinking this was a good introduction to Tudor history. The Twisted Tale of Bloody Mary went off general assumptions of Anne Boleyn. The other Boleyn girl was just lazy. But this version of Anne seems to have originated from a place of deep-seated spite. Who hurt you, Peter Morgan? HBC, as I'm going to call her from now on just to save time, was pregnant during the filming of this series, so her dresses are cut to hide it, and once you know, you can't unsee it. The main problem with this Anne is plagiarism. Instead of making his own interpretation, Peter Morgan took the lazy way out and wrote an amalgamation of 3 different Annes that you're also going to see on this list soon down the line. One is a sympathetic figure, the second is morally grey, and the third is more scheming and vindictive. It's more than a little jarring to try and cram all 3 in at once, and Morgan can't decide a consistent characterisation. So he dives into this vision of an unsympathetic plotter who deserved everything she got. And that leads me to an absolutely unnecessary scene where Henry responds to accusations of adultery by... Look, when it gets to this part, this would be the perfect time to send your children and grandma out of the room. Yeah, it's not enough for Henry to execute Anne for BS reasons. He has to assault her too. That'll prove to the audience that he's a bad guy. I felt nothing watching her downfall. All I wanted was to watch the original versions that these were ripping off. I feel nothing for this performance. I'm super annoyed that there are 4 more wives to go through for this awful series.
That women can be the match of men.
It's a question women have asked themselves for some time. But we concede men do have some value. So we accept them as equal.
This incarnation wins the award for the biggest waste of potential. I admit this was my gateway drug into my Anne Boleyn obsession, but I credit that more to Natalie Portman herself than the quality of this film. When Peter Morgan isn't copy-pasting his terrible dialogue from Henry VIII, you could see a good interpretation of Anne Boleyn just dying to come out. I love that scene when she comes back from the French court and openly flirts with Henry. It's a scene I can reasonably believe would have happened between their real-life counterparts. Her trial scene and execution are also pretty good, but again, we will get to the execution scene in part 3. Unlike the previous Anne, this one already has a basis because of the source material, and yeah, I'm no hashtag Team Philippa, but a consistent character is better than an amalgamation of 3 vastly different interpretations. Unfortunately, those are the only flowers in the pot of dirt that is the rest of this film, and the biggest problem with it is that it can't decide if Anne is a villain or not. One minute we're watching her rising influence at court, her cunning at playing the game, and always having something clever to say. Her actions win Henry's attention and stops him from turning away from the Boleyn faction. She's doing exactly as her father and uncle want.
Like, what was I meant to do?
But all this intelligence is suddenly punished when Henry... Well, let's just say when Catherine of Aragon walks out of the movie, skip to the next scene if you're watching this on DVD or Blu-ray. If you're streaming it, just go forward about 3 or 4 minutes. You'll be grateful. The in-between doesn't bear thinking about. Anne doesn't get a single moment to enjoy being queen. Henry, for some reason, resents her even when he's confident that she's pregnant with his son. All I can wonder is, why did you two get married again? You two can't stand to be in each other's presence. Thankfully, there's no incest in this version, but the fact that it gets as far as Anne and George getting into bed is still super gross. I used to fast forward that part too. Luckily for Natalie, she's gained a knack for giving the best performance possible despite less than stellar writing. Her accent is greatly improved from when she was in V for Vendetta, having taken dialect lessons for this role, and I can tell that she was really dedicated to do right by Anne Boleyn and give a good performance that probably would have warranted an Oscar nod if it was in a better film, and I can't wholly condemn her performance. I just wish it was a better movie. But it's not too late, we can always try again. In fact, let's get to it, let's give Natalie another chance.
Isn't it a pity to lose a head like this? Still, they will easily find a nickname for me. Among the queens of England, I shall be Anne Sans-Tête.
Now this is an Anne Boleyn with some historical significance. She is one of the first screen interpretations that still survives today. She doesn't have a huge role in this film, as the beginning revolves around her execution, with not only her preparing for her fate, but the ladies of the court are quickly replacing her initials on royal pillows with Jane Seymour's. The executioner from Calais is preparing his sword and arguing with the English headsman, and Jane Seymour herself is preparing to marry Henry. It's a shame this one's such a short venture, because I wish we could have seen more of her. Oberon gives Anne a subtle performance, trying to stay calm while she can hear workmen still building her scaffold. Meanwhile, you see the fear in her eyes, especially when it's time to go. Her simple line of, "It's a lovely day," packs more of a punch than most of the Annes we've seen so far. Okay, this Anne is a brief cameo, but I'd feel remiss if I didn't mention it. Redgrave's Anne only gets one scene and she doesn't even get a line. But the quality and authenticity of the movie itself makes this brief appearance forgivable. A Man for All Seasons explores Sir Thomas More's struggle with the King's great matter and his ultimate refusal to recognise Henry as head of the Church of England. The scene in question, where Anne appears, is just after her ascension, where she is celebrating with Henry. Robert Shaw's Henry VIII, which is second only to Keith Michelle, sings and drinks while she laughs. He thinks he sees Sir Thomas More in the crowd, and he's desperate to rekindle their friendship. However, he's disappointed to discover that his friend and mentor isn't there. The film has a small main cast and uses only a handful of locations like Hampton Court, More's house at Chelsea and the Tower of London. It clearly shows that this was a film based on a play and they didn't do much to fully take advantage of what film could do, besides exterior shots, which are pretty damn good. If you were doing this on stage, it would be very easy to change sets and have this version of Anne be played by one of the ensemble cast. So you might ask, why is such a brief cameo on this list when I didn't include young Bess? Well, because this movie has baby John Hurt in it, and that alone is worth a watch. So go and watch this movie once we finish this video. It is an amazing movie and you will not be disappointed.
When Wolsey returns?
Sir, if you were free, I would give myself to you. My heart and my body.
This is an amazing movie, terribly underrated, but this isn't my favourite Anne. Unfortunately, the lack of screen time in this movie really shows its colours in Charlotte's incarnation, where she can't have a fully rounded character to stand on her own. Her first scene shows her and Henry having already met, which sums up their courtship of Henry pining after her and trying to snag what little physical satisfaction he can get, while Anne always has a clever thing to say to justify her rejection. Even though Anne has a larger chunk of screen time than most of the wives, the shortness of the film stops her from having anything else but a femme fatale persona, where she is quick to achieve Henry's attention. And yes, there is a significant scene where a masque takes place. A masque is a sort of production which takes place in royal courts, especially in the Renaissance period, where popular stories are told through dances and dumb show. This was the only place in a pre-Restoration England where a woman could legally perform. Anne stars as the Ethiop Queen, or the Queen of Sheba, which, yeah, heads up, it involves blackface. Lots and lots of blackface. I can understand our modern audiences probably being put off with this movie because of that one scene. And I can guarantee that if we remade this film today, this scene would either be drastically changed or omitted. I mean, in the Tudors, they also have a scene with a mask, but, you know, they chose one that was more culturally sensitive, so props to them. But in context, this isn't as overtly offensive as the Jazz Singer or the Censored 11 cartoons, which were infamously bigoted and mocked a marginalised community. For one thing, we can't ignore that this form of pageantry, which frequently appropriated different cultures and had white people taking the place of people of colour, was considered normal back then, and we can judge the use of it now, but it's not going to suddenly change people's ethics in the 16th century. The scene also has a thematic purpose, as we're supposed to see a clear parallel between the Queen of Sheba, as the legendary dark beauty of the Bible, and Anne Boleyn, who was also a legendary dark beauty who encapsulated and corrupted a king. And for another thing, the scene also has a narrative purpose, because this is where Anne's downfall begins. Henry gets triggered not by the blackface, but by Anne and her entourage mocking Cardinal Wolsey. So he's already prepared to start the #CancelAnneBoleyn party were she not pregnant. And this is where we also get our first glimpse of Jane Seymour. Anne's next scene has her confronting Henry for his adultery, but it's not as stupidly done as it's usually portrayed when she's calling him out in public. She waits until they're in private, and she doesn't have any qualms about yelling at him because he's not going to physically attack when she is pregnant. Her final scene is at the May Day joust, where coincidental moments of giggling with her male entourage and giving Henry Norris a favour, aka just a handkerchief to wear on the end of his lance during the joust, drives Henry to go forward with getting rid of her. In my last video, I said it was possible that the events covered in this movie were likely heavily biased, as they're told from Henry's perspective while he's on his deathbed looking back at his life. And his relationship with Anne clearly did not end well, so this vindictive and unsympathetic Anne would likely be how he remembers her, this bewitching, sharp-tongued temptress. And I think this would explain and justify why this is the only incarnation on this list that shows Anne with the infamous sixth finger that the Catholic propagandists claim she had. We'll get to this whole extra finger thing when we get to part 4. It's not so much a finger as a giant growth on her pinky with an extra fingernail. Probably the best they could do with such a small budget, but it looks like something that a Habsburg prince would be afflicted with, and something that could easily be hidden. She does hide it throughout the film with a conspicuous white glove, which honestly hints more that she's got something to hide, rather than if she just wore 2 gloves. Charlotte's Anne is good for what it is, but like the rest of the wives in the film, just as you're getting used to them, they're gone.
Do you feel I am?
You may be. I hardly know you.
You know, it's a shame that I swore off The Crown, because Claire Foy is an excellent actress and she does a really good interpretation here. Wolf Hall depicts Thomas Cromwell as he witnesses the fall of his master Wolsey and the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn, which he orchestrates. And just like with Henry VIII and his 6 wives, you can imagine that events and people are biased through his perspective, so it is reasonable that he would view Anne as snobbish and authoritative. She says his name as Cromwell with a French inflection, almost condescendingly. You can tell he wants to hate her, but he is simultaneously impressed by how well she can turn a phrase. Over time, he sees her as an ally, and they help each other as they rise to power. But unlike Henry VIII and his 6 wives, there is time in this miniseries to flesh out otherwise antagonistic characters and give them fleshed out personalities. Honestly, if anyone gets a raw deal in this series, it's Thomas More, but that is a subject for another day. Anne seems antagonistic at first, but the longer we stay with her, the more sympathetic she becomes. By the final episode, Cromwell has actually come to respect her over the years, but when Henry is angry, it's every man or woman for themselves. Plus, it is so cathartic to see Jane Parker, Anne's sister-in-law, get slapped in the face when she spends the whole series bitching. And yes, for once, we actually get an Anne whose sexuality isn't front and centre. Any speculation about her relations before marrying Henry are left ambiguous, with Henry Percy's bragging portrayed as more likely to be a lie. Her downfall, and that of her lovers, is Cromwell's revenge for the ousting of Wolsey. Basically, it's just so refreshing to have an Anne portrayed as an actual human and not an inconsistent mess or a caricature of her worst traits. I mean, I don't really hate anything about this series. It just happens that the 4 Annes that are coming after this one are just my personal preference. And remember, we'll get to the executions when we get to part 3, and I will have more to say about Foy's Anne there.
I'm that Boleyn girl and I'm up next. See, I broke England from the church. Yeah, I'm that sexy. Why did I lose my head? Or my sleeves may be green, but my lipsticks are red.
Now, the last time I was covering this, I ended up getting a copyright claim, and I was really worried that I was going to have to actually sing the relevant lyrics myself, but then I found out that the claimant didn't actually own the rights to Six the Musical, so I ended up confronting that. And for goodness sake, YouTube, get your act together. People have been telling you about false claims for years now. Just, for God's sake, sort yourself out. Yes, so Six the Musical. The same rules go as last time, and because it's a stage musical with numerous runs, then we're going to have to throw in all the actresses who have played Anne Boleyn in the musical, from Broadway, West End, Edinburgh, UK tour, etc, etc. This sounds a mixed bag. I love her song, but it's not my favourite. That honour goes to Catherine Howard, but I digress. I do love this Anne, don't get me wrong. So let's start with Anne's intro. Between the songs there is dialogue as they argue amongst themselves, tease each other and introduce each wife. A running joke of the musical is to have the wives prematurely claim themselves the winner, and this is how we get into Anne's introduction, because immediately after Catherine of Aragon has finished her song, she declares herself the winner, but the other wives aren't having it, because they realise that there's that other one, a really important one, the really famous controversial one that people actually care about, which, you know, I just kind of found personally very funny. And we get a dramatic build-up with this intense music labelling the second queen with cruel traits, from temptress to the one who chased the king but paid the price with a swordsman's swing. But when Anne does show up, at least from what I've seen in the animatics, because I haven't seen the musical live yet, so I don't know how this plans out. I was going to, but then a pandemic happened. She's not conniving at all. She's not a winking temptress. She's just an ordinary woman on her phone. And then we get to the song, Don't Lose Your Head. It's not 100% accurate, but I'm picking my battles here. It reminds me of Taylor Swift at her most Look What You Made Me Do, with a sprinkle of Iggy Azalea, Avril Lavigne, Miley Cyrus and Lily Allen. All artists I've enjoyed. I suppose my main gripe is that Anne's a bit ditzy in this. She seems to have left the French court to find a man, but all the men in the UK suck, and when she meets the king, her father says, you should try and get ahead. Get it? It's a pun. She contradicts the other queen's claims that she chased Henry because he was messaging me like every day. She is interested, but she doesn't outright confirm her affections and replies, I'll think about it maybe, XO baby. And that's the motif throughout the song. Anne says shocking things which affects her circumstances. Reply to the king's letter? You live with his wife now. Says Catherine has used goods. The country hates you now. Hint that Henry is impotent. You're dead now. Anne has zero brain-to-mouth filter in this, and that gets her in trouble. And I suppose it's a reference to how Cromwell managed to twist things that she said as either a joke or a tease into a villainous testimony against her. I don't think the lyric, if that's how it's going to be, maybe I'll flirt with a guy or 3 just to make him gel, is a statement that the creators think Anne was guilty of the crimes she was accused of. It's more that she had quite a close-knit group of male friends, and she said some flirty things to them, and Henry was infuriated with his sharp-tongued wife and emasculated by her when she wouldn't fall in line after they were married. Her costume is meant to be a reference to the belief that Henry dedicated the song Greensleeves to her. This didn't really happen, but the bright green dress is a great contrast to her red lipstick. She gets her iconic bee necklace in the form of a choker, along with a pair of Sailor Moon buns which Millie O'Connell, the original actress to play Anne in the West End, said to have thought up herself and became part of the character's look from then on. The final song, which lets the wives choose an alternate future for themselves, allows Anne to become a successful singer-songwriter, remixing Greensleeves into her own thing, where now she writes lyrics for Shakespeare P, finally able to use her intelligence to pursue her passions.
It was not all you, or Norfolk, or George, or any other man you want to name. It was also me. He fell in love with me. He respected me.
Okay, if you've seen my video on Catherine of Aragon, which I hope you have, you'll know that I see the Tudors as a guilty pleasure more than history brought to life. It's ridiculously silly, especially the first few episodes of the first season where they try to cram the first couple decades of Henry's reign into a few episodes. But the last 2 seasons are some of the best that the show's ever produced, and we'll get to those when we reach Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. And as of this recording, I just rewatched the episode in the first season where everyone's dying of the sweating sickness and Henry is isolating himself and doing whatever he can to avoid dying of the sweating sickness because it's picking everyone off left, right and centre. And right at the end there's a mass of memorial where you can see in the church there's massive gaps and people struggling to hold back tears, and it is probably the most relatable thing I've seen in ages. Plus, as inaccurate as the series is, the casting is pretty well done, especially of the 6 wives, and Natalie Dormer really saves this show from falling down ITV's rabbit hole of mediocrity. The problem I had with HBC's Anne, when such a talented actress would have been a perfect fit for her, was that she was a mishmash of previous versions and had no consistency. Thankfully, the Tudors doesn't do this, they go off and do their own thing, and make Anne a proper character with flaws and redeeming features. Anne's family is more than willing to exploit her, but she is not as naive as her sister is. Having seen the way Henry dumped her so quickly, she is clearly reluctant to go the same way, and manages to convince Henry not to use her as his mistress. Her kinder side emerges on occasion, especially in the episode I just mentioned where she comforts one of her maids, which unfortunately leads to her having the sweating sickness, and we see how scary it must have been for her family. The second season completely focuses on her reign, showing her growing frustration with herself and Henry. The show takes advantage of dramatic irony, where the audience sees full scenes in full context, but characters who might have been just behind the corner or not knowing the full extent of a situation would be convinced that Anne was guilty of the crimes she's eventually accused of. Such as this scene when George is trying to calm her down and her sleeve slips off her shoulder. One of her ladies in waiting sees her pull up her sleeve and assumes something potentially incriminating. For all this show loves its sex scenes, I commend it for keeping Anne's innocence intact and not having her actually sleep with the men she's accused with, because I imagine that temptation was probably there. And this automatically makes it better than the other Boleyn girl. The execution is pretty well done and probably one of my favourite interpretations of this scene, but again we'll get to that next time. Once Anne has been executed, her shadow hangs over the court, and nowhere is it more present than in Elizabeth. She isn't seen much in season 3, but in season 4 she's in almost every episode, smiling and speaking in a way that appeals to all the adults, and winning the hearts of her last 2 stepmothers, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. But it isn't until the final episode, when Henry is confronted by the ghosts of his first 3 wives, that we see Elizabeth's true colours, and how much Anne's death haunts Henry. While Catherine came to chastise him for his neglect, Anne has come to assault him with the truth. Anne's spirit, or Henry's hallucination, depending on how you interpret it, declares she is fiercely proud of her daughter's intelligence, and notes that Elizabeth knew how to avoid the king's wrath by not being intemperate as Anne was. Henry admits that he's also proud of her, but confesses that she is too much like Anne and reminds him of what she did to him. Anne, who keeps a calm face throughout the scene, suddenly breaks, and she replies, "I did nothing to you. I was innocent. All the accusations against me were false. I thought you knew." And he did know. It was his idea. She also references Catherine Howard, but we'll get to that when we reach her rankings. Anne leaves Henry a crying mess, but when he turns around to beg her to stay, she disappears. Almost immediately after, we get a scene where Henry says goodbye to Mary, Elizabeth and Catherine Parr. Mary is genuinely sad because she knows what danger she'll be in without her father's protection. Catherine we'll get to later, but Elizabeth doesn't change her expression, and once Henry's back is turned, she walks away, revealing that her smiling, sweet nature was an act, and she has always secretly resented her father for what he did to Anne.
Should the king have me executed, which I don't, I look down on your face and see that you would have it so. Could you ask him to make it quick?
Dorothy Chewton's Anne is the only wife to get speaking roles in more than one episode. She first appears in the Catherine of Aragon episode, winding up one of her Spanish ladies, with a few extra non-speaking scenes shown alongside Catherine's declining health. When we get into her episode proper, there's no point going back to feature the rise to power again, so we begin with a montage of her reign, with Henry being romantic and playful with her, and we also get our first glimpse of Elizabeth. The montage ends with a transition from them singing Green Growth the Holly to Mark Smeaton finishing the song, with Anne and Henry standing a significant distance apart from one another. The series suffered from a low budget, hence the repetitive sets and how rarely the costumes change. But, as I said last time, the acting in this series is flawless. Hammy, yes, but that's the style they're going with, and they stick with it. I think Dorothy Chewton is the most authentic of Anne's interpretations. If we got to look through a time window and see what Anne Boleyn really looked like and how she acted, I'd imagine we'd see something a lot like Dorothy Chewton. There's a lot of shouting in this episode, probably the shoutiest of the whole series, but Chewton can match her volume to Keith Michelle, who roars in literally every scene he's in. Anne is clearly in an unstable position as her current pregnancy will make or break her marriage. This scene where Henry is shot from her perspective, saying, "Pray for a son," is an excellent use of foreshadowing for Henry's tyrannical nature. Before she miscarries, she confides her fears in Cranmer, which humanises her, when thus far she's been sharp and scathing with everyone she talks to. We get a good focus on her downfall. Wolf Hall is probably the only series that focuses on it just as closely, but that was being told through Cromwell's perspective. This series is focused entirely on Anne, showing Anne trying to keep her calm and regal exterior in such terrifying circumstances. Her laughing in the face of her accusations is honestly a natural human response when people accuse you of something that isn't true, especially something so ridiculous as sleeping with your own brother. This is truly the best demonstration of Anne trying to maintain a brave face. She was under constant surveillance with no privacy, but she held in her fear the entire time. It's also interesting that Dorothy Chewton bears a close resemblance to Glenda Jackson, who would go on to play Elizabeth in the sequel to this series, Elizabeth R. So if you were watching both series back to back, you could notice the similarity almost immediately.
Yes, I've been told it's not safe for any of us to say no to our king. That put on, kindly, hail fellow well met of yours. My father's house will be pulled down, and Northumberland's too, they tell me. Well, pull them down, your majesty, you are what I said.
I don't know how obvious it was that this was my favourite of all the Annes, but there are so many things about this version that I love. Bujold wins over Chewton, mainly because we see the whole story from beginning to end. Obviously because there's a higher budget for this movie. There's more space to move around. It's not moving between two different rooms and saying, okay, this is Greenwich, this is Hampton Court. And Six Wives barely covers the build-up before we get to the downfall. This version gives Anne one thing that all the other interpretations have forgotten, namely Anne's French accent that she picked up in France. Because Bujold is a French-Canadian actress, she has no problem making the French inflections, so she definitely sounds distinct from the rest of the English court. Instead of a woman who was plotting and vindictive from the start, this version of Anne shows a woman who had her dream of a fairy tale romance ripped away from her, starting her down a path of revenge against Wolsey, where she actually discovers her true calling in politics, and eventually feels sorry for Wolsey when he is unceremoniously ousted from his position. Unlike Rampling's Anne, who rejects Henry with a flirtatious manner, Bujold mercilessly rebuffs him, calling him a spoiled child without any fear of the consequences. Even at the end, she isn't afraid to speak her mind to Henry. The final scene between Henry and Anne, of course, didn't actually happen in real life, but it is so damn well acted and written that I could watch it hundreds of times over and never get bored of it. She deserved that Academy Award nomination. Unfortunately, she didn't win it because she was up against some stiff competition that year, and Maggie Smith ended up taking home the Oscar, but if you're going to lose the Oscar to anyone, Maggie Smith is probably the best person to come in second to. Anne of the Thousand Days is probably one of the best female-led movies ever made, especially in a time female writers and directors couldn't cement themselves in the mainstream, and primary female roles were usually love interests or villains. I honestly recommend going and giving it a watch right away, wherever you can find it. I've had it on DVD for over a decade. But it's one of those movies I can always pick up, and you can notice different things in the background. You can look at all the detailing they do in the costuming, the scenery is gorgeous. For a movie that's an adapted play, it really takes advantage of what they can use film for, whereas A Man for All Seasons was quite minimalist in comparison.
My heart to see my love again. Alone, alone, I longed for her. All mistresses forsaking, now must I tell my hopes and fear of love in her awaking.
Thanks so much for watching. This video was much longer than I expected it to be. I'm getting the hang of editing and capturing images and speaking more confidently. The whole reason the Catherine of Aragon video took so long is because I'm just so new at this. And remember, it's just me behind the scenes. I'm doing all the editing, the writing and the capturing of footage, and believe me, I'm not the most confident person. But this is helping, really. I said I'd run out of things to do during lockdown, but it's just giving me something to do every day. Just get up, write some script, capture some footage, edit a segment together. It has helped, honestly. The editing of the video was much easier this time, but for some reason the software I'm using really doesn't like the 2003 version of The Other Boleyn Girl because it corrupted the file. But who can blame it, really? I'm really glad you got to the end and that you're watching me say my goodbyes right now. Please let me know what you thought of my rankings of these Annes. Which one did you prefer? Are there some you haven't heard of before and you want to look into? I understand that when I did my Catherine of Aragon video, some people hadn't heard of some of the dramas, and I'm glad to have enlightened you on them. And share it around and spare me from the dreaded algorithm. I'll see you next time on the scaffold.